I was like, whose dumb voice is that? It's like, oh, it's mine.
All right. So guess what? I'm streaming live to YouTube, Christian,
Yeah.
and welcome to everyone. My name is Renee Hobbs, and you're here for SOS, the urgency of poetry in a digital age. Some of you are returning. This is part 2 in a 3-part series, but some of you are joining us for the first time. And whether you're here for the second time or joining us for the first time, we invite you to put your name and location into the chat room today.
Yes,
Um,
please.
I am so delighted to welcome Christian Shockley to this program. It was his genius idea as we think about the connections between media literacy and the humanities, and having an expert help us think through the importance and relevance of poetry at this particular moment in time. What a gift and blessing it is for all of us. Thank you so much, Christian, for shepherding us through a great learning experience. So take it away.
Awesome. I love that word, shepherding. I hope that's what we can do. So if you were with us last week, you heard me talk a lot and recite some poems. Today, Melbourne, Australia. That's amazing. Thank you for joining us. You're probably joining us from the future, actually. Anyway, sorry, that distracted me. Today, last week was all me reciting these poems and sharing these ideas. Today is going to be us creating some things together. So let's go ahead and dive in, because I want to see what you all create. Sneak peek. Last week we covered this concept of poetry to die for. Why when everything goes topsy-turvy do people turn to poetry? And we looked at 5 big purposes, 5 big things that poetry can be for us. This week, we're going to look at 5 activities that kind of bring those purposes of poetry into our own lives. And also, maybe more importantly, ways that we can help to communicate them to others, especially in teaching environments. A lot of these are born out of my own experience teaching high school literature, but also teaching poetry to adult learners, continuing ed learners through classes online. So we're going to talk about moving from ephemeral to eternal, and I think you'll see what I mean by that through a lot of the mediums that we're going to look at today. So let's dive in. By the way, I'm going to share a link to a lot of this. I think in today's session, probably during today's session, toward the end. So take notes or don't take notes, mainly just immerse yourself in the experience. To those of you who are back, thank you so much for coming back. I was nervous and then immediately relieved and then finally rejuvenated by being able to talk to you all last week, and was kind of riding a high from that experience. So thank you for coming back to talk with me about these ideas, and thank you for those of you who are showing up for the first time. I hope you can watch last week. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I think that's on YouTube, on the Media Education Lab YouTube channel. I was amazed at Renee's speed of getting that up online. That was made my procrastinating heart feel a little bit of shame. I've got this maybe kind of cheeky line last week on the urgency of poetry, kind of like we're a soap opera. My mom used to, by the way, next week we're going to just tell a bunch of stories. My mom used to clean houses. And she owned her own cleaning business. No matter where we moved, she just would start a cleaning business. She's amazing at not only starting that business, but then starting all these friendships out of it. And sometimes when I was really young, I'd go to these houses with her, and I'd watch soap operas while she cleaned houses, because that's the only thing on TV. And this just reminded me of a soap opera last week on the urgency of poetry, like Days of Our Lives or something. We talked about 5 big things that poetry can be for us. I would love to, I wonder if I can pull up, I don't think I can pull up the chat, but I'd love to see if any of you remember what those 5 things are and see if they stuck with you at all. Renee, maybe you can call out, since you have your eyes on the chat, what we're getting.
Silence.
Yes, there we go. So we've got our silence badge. Anyone else? Okay, descent. We talked about gentle and volatile descent in through poetry. Any other ideas popping in?
Listening, somebody says.
Yes. So attention. Let's see if we can get that one. Yeah, here we go. Attention. So poetry is calling our calling our minds to both a broad kind of universal scope, and then down to even the most specific things, the most particular things, like a grapefruit. And we read that.
Jennifer says eternal.
Yes. So we've got eternity, and then finally, do we remember that last one? The final one we talked about. And I think kind of a pervasive one as well. We've got ambiguity. Poetry can be for us a paradox. So we've got these badges today, these little doodles that I've come up with, and I want you to keep these in your back pocket. And we're actually going to kind of award badges to different activities that we go through today. So as you see an activity that we come up with, connect to one of these 5 things that poetry can be for us, call it out in the chat, and we'll kind of award badges to each activity. So we've got these 5 things: silence, dissent, eternity, attention, and ambiguity. This week, we're going to talk about 5 particular activities, but really we're going to be talking about 3 specific ideas. So here are the 3 big ideas I want us to kind of see and enjoy and live in today. By the way, the rules of last week's session apply. This isn't a talk about dissection, or my least favorite word when it comes to poetry, I think, analysis, right? We're not putting poems on couches and asking them about their childhoods. We are instead trying to live with them in a particular way. We're asking poetry to create a room for us that we get to live in, with a particular set of furniture and a particular set of things to explore. Today, we are going to make blank pages the enemy. So often, if you're a writer or a reader, I think, especially if you're approaching writing for the first time, blank pages are so intimidating, but they are also helpfully often unnecessary. So we're going to make blank pages the enemy today. Second, I want us to experience poetry as a tactile medium. So I say here that poetry uses the tools of writing, but it really has the spirit of sculpture. Last week, we talked a lot about the idea of blank space and margin. And there was this quote from Simon Armitage, where he says that poetry is in its nature a medium of dissent. It rejects, a left to right reading. Sometimes it rejects using an entire page or filling up an entire page. Instead, it's trying to make its own way through this blank space of the margins of the page. So we're going to experience poetry as a kind of sculpture. And then third, we want to talk about poetry as a response. A lot of our ideas from last week have this in them, that poetry is a response to something happening to us. Instead of us building a world, and some of my descriptions here are going to be simplistic, instead of us building a world like a novelist might do, instead, we are rebuilding the world that is given to us, whether it's a world of sound that we're turning into a particular kind of silence, whether it's a world of oppression that we are pushing back against, whether it's a world that is fading away, like that Lucille Clifton poem, Here Yet Be Dragons. So many languages have fallen off the edge of the world into the dragon's mouth. We might be pushing against that inevitable destruction or decay. We might be pushing against our tendency to forget or our tendency to miss. And then finally, we're pushing against our tendency to have to arrive at a destination, right? So much of poetry is responding to these various things. So let's dive in. These are going to get progressively more difficult as we go along, these 5 kind of ways of interacting with poetry in ways that aren't necessarily writing poetry. These are going to get more difficult as we go along. They're also going to get a little bit more ambiguous as we go along, but hopefully playfully so. And get ready to do some writing, rewriting, coloring yourself. And I'm really excited to see what you make today. So first off is really, I think one of the ways that I maybe deepened my love of poetry. If you were with us last week, I talked about like this interaction with John Milton, not that I met him personally. I talked about like memorizing poetry, but really something that helped me a lot was this idea of blackout poetry. And I'm sure that this is not new to many of us. Blackout poems became really popular probably around 2009, 2010. They've been around for a long time, but they became really popular. I wonder if in the chat, anybody is going to know the patron poet of blackout poems. I'd love to see some names pop up. Renee, do we have any names popping up? We've got this guy. Maybe it's less familiar.
Burroughs, Cleon.
There we go. Austin Cleon. Austin Cleon wrote this book, Steal Like an Artist. He also published this book, Newspaper Blackout. And he's really done a fantastic job at popularizing, I'm going to say, accessible ways for us to stretch our creative brain. And one of those is through blackout poetry. He calls himself a writer who draws, which I think is a lovely bio, a perfect thing to put on a business card. He is kind of a career hero of mine. In another part of my life, I do a lot of like vocational guidance, vocational counseling, and he very often pops up as my own kind of career hero, someone to follow. It was really through viewing his work that I got into making blackout poetry myself. If you don't know about blackout poetry is the process. Here's a poem I made this last weekend of taking I have strong opinions, I'll share in just a minute, of taking newsprint or a magazine and trying to weave a path, trying to weave a new message that is maybe a little bit more eternal in a very ephemeral medium. So you start with columns of text. This weekend, I was working in Martha Stewart's magazine. I can't remember, Living. Right. So I've actually got the copy here, Living with Martha Stewart. I was working in there. So I first kind of noticed this really nice fill up. And then I've got my subject over here, and then I start crafting something out of it. I saw a thick leather bound ledger, which I loved. That was so evocative and so tactile to me. So I traced a path there. Then I started noticing some of my verbs. So I had over here logs. I thought that could be nice. You'll notice I added each page. What does each page do? Each page, is it going to extract or is it going to log? What do I want? I mark a couple of verbs for myself there. Then I start making some choices, and you'll see I start connecting the dots. I fill up a thick leather-bound ledger, each page an extract. And then we're going to craft our path towards some kind of conclusion, an extract of mystery no one can solve, a fashioned atmosphere of want. And then we start coloring in. So I start blacking everything out, and I accidentally made a little mistake and blurred the edges. Again, this very tactile thing. I had ink on the side of my pinky. Where I was writing. So I just decided I'm going to blur the whole edge, and that's going to be kind of a thing. And there we have our conclusion. I fill up a thick leather-bound ledger, each page an extract of mystery no one can solve, a fashioned atmosphere of want. This becomes a really playful way to start interacting with language. Eventually, I found for myself that you kind of enter a space where it's more like you're doing a crossword puzzle mixed with a word search. And your brain enters this new space where instead of saying things like, what do I have to say to people? Right? That's very often a question that maybe in a writer's existential nightmare, they're thinking about like, well, what do I really have to say to people on their, most discouraged days? Instead, it's what meaning can I make from all these words? I wonder, kind of in the chat, if you had to award some badges to this activity of blackout poetry. So we've got this idea of silence, attention, dissent, eternity or eternal, and then ambiguity. Kind of how do you see some of these things that poetry can be for us showing up in this medium of blackout poetry? Renee, if you don't mind maybe being the voice.
Yep. So I'm just echoing your point about this crossword puzzle plus word search allows you to sidestep the problem of not having anything to say.
Yes.
I think attention comes to mind.
For
the
sure.
way that your eye scanned, not like you weren't reading in the same way we think about reading, like reading comprehension. You were reading for like discovery.
Yes.
So,
It's actually anti-comprehension in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Gene Kilbourne says ambiguity is another feature of this kind of poetry writing.
Yes, I think that you're exactly right. And that comes up a lot whenever we think about the subject that we're going to choose and then the verbs that we're going to choose. I'm going to flip over right here real quick, maybe as some responses come in. So I actually ended up making kind of a version of a version of Austin Cleon's book, a little book called Found, a collection of blackout poetry. So this is a little account on Instagram that
you did it on Instagram?
Yeah, to promote the book. It was like it was really popular to use Instagram as a kind of web page. So it's how to make a blackout poem that kind of goes through the same thing. I don't know if this would ever be helpful to show in a class or something like that. And then a few poems. So what came to mind when we were talking about ambiguity? I'm going to pause on this one, actually. This is one of my favorites. Death writes a novel. The title is obvious. The stories evoke the vagaries of life. The result is killer. You never know kind of what you're going to get whenever you get newsprint. But I ended up having this whole selection of poetry that is kind of like blackout love poems, where I had these subjects of her and she. And as soon as I got kind of on a roll of having her and she as subject matter, anytime I'd be, in the process of making a blackout poem, my eyes would kind of be drawn to, is this going to be a blackout love poem, or is it going to be something else? So you start to kind of like train your attention for particular things.
Nice. Christian Fred Haas says there's an inherent dissent in taking one text and making it into another.
Oh, yes. I can't tell you how many times I took delight in finding an article I didn't agree with and making it say something entirely different that probably the author of the article would not have enjoyed. And there's something you kind of revel in that dissent. I think that's so good. I've got a few little steps here of what it's like to create a blackout poem, kind of how you can train your mind to start doing this activity. By the way, this is therapeutic. It is meditative almost. So you first kind of catch a central phrase. Like the other day, I was flipping through the Martha Stewart. I got these from my landlord, by the way, actually. He just had an attic full of old Martha Stewart magazines. So I just said, hey, can I have those? I saw this like beautiful phrase that was something about like caramel, molasses, and I wanted that to be at the heart of a blackout poem, right? Then you find your subject. So who's going to be involved in this little narrative that we're crafting? You punch it up with the verbs. Very often, that's where you get a lot of choice, like with that, the fill up, the extract, the log. And then you craft your conclusion. Where is this finally going to go? They're often very short, but very satisfying to create. My hot take on Blackout Poetry before we move on for the sake of time, because we've got 4 more of these to go through. I see a lot of people on Instagram using novels as a Blackout Poetry text. I say, don't do that. There's something so nice about using a medium to, I think it was Fred's point about dissent. There's something so nice about using a medium that is one, ephemeral, meant to be thrown away, and turning it into something that is greater than the very time-bound message that it's often originally intended for, and turning it into this thing that's meant to last. The other thing is that we need these columns often, because it's the very thing that's going to make the text scannable, and it's going to allow us to start drawing those ambiguous connections across the page. It's the thing that makes it feel like a word search or a puzzle. A few more tips for making Blackout Poetry. Use text that's meant to be discarded. And newsprint feels good. It also shows up really well if you're taking pictures of it, which is really nice. Map multiple routes to give yourself options. That's really nice, because you're going to be forced to make a decision. You start with more words than you need, and then you edit down to the only the ones that you need, which is such a poetic act. When I was teaching high school literature, I would do this with my students so that they could see poetry's concision, like we talked about last week, the packability of poetry, that it's saying a lot in just a few words. And then finally, allow yourself to enjoy the vocabulary of different magazines. Kind of at the height of my Blackout Poetry creation, when I was doing it just about every day, I would always use the New Yorker, because who reads an entire New Yorker magazine? And they have to be good for something. Oh my goodness, I just reminded myself of that really good scene in The Good Place where they're about to torture the main character, Michael. I'm sure some of you have seen The Good Place. And the way that they torture him is by putting him in a room full of New Yorker magazines that he's never going to read. Allow yourself to enjoy the vocabulary. Each of these magazines or newspapers have their own editorial board, their own cities that they're crafted around. So you're going to get a different vocabulary, and you start to pick up on different things that you're going to get from different sources. I say here, if you want semicolons, go make Blackout Poems from the New Yorker. It's full of colons and semicolons, right? The editorial guidelines are all for it. Okay, let's move on to our next one, which is the collage poem. This is one that I've been kind of more into recently. This is where I take especially packaging. You'll see here I've taken some Band-Aid boxes, some pencil boxes, other things. And you start making little poems, little very ambiguous poems out of these various things. Our patron poet here is John Ashberry. And I chose this very young picture of John Ashberry because, frankly, what a heartthrob. I mean, look at that guy, those eyes. To write poetry and look that fantastic, my goodness. Collages help us answer this really important question. How can we give poetic thinking physical form? So many of the kind of ways of teaching and interacting with poetry that we're going to talk about today are really about embodying poetic thinking. And if we can make it physical, we can make it more accessible. And very often collages help us to do that. And we're always moving from concrete to abstract whenever we're making these collages. John Ashberry actually has an entire book where the title is something like They Wanted Poems and Collages or something like that. And it's a whole book of collages and poems about collages. It's beautiful. Here are a few that I've made in the last few weeks, kind of moving from concrete to abstract. So I do a lot of leather work outside of my regular work, which means I cut my finger a lot, especially my thumb. I've cut it, I think, twice in the last 2 months. I need to invest in some gloves or something. So I have a lot of Band-Aid boxes around the house, and I made this little poem about out of Band-Aid boxes. Band-Aid, Band-Aid, Band-Aid. Note: no protection for your inside wounds. For those, trust healing care, good, clean fun, and love so you can bounce back. A very kind of literal thing, but you're restricted by what were those carefully crafted phrases that Band-Aid could put on a box. What were the promises that Band-Aid could make to me? And then how could I break those? How could I break those things down literally and metaphorically to make something new? Here's another one. This one, you'll notice, is getting much more ambiguous. This was pencil boxes. I got some Tombow pencils that are really beautiful. I love pencils. I've got way more pencils than I could ever write with. To be or not to be the ouch, what I imagine is in a bug's mind. Am I going to torment picnickers today or not? And then finally, something a lot more abstract and something that will probably show where my mind is sometimes at conceptually. This hourglass I made out of a pencil box, which probably feels a lot like that little badge for eternity that we've used now for the last few weeks. We begin to embody particular concepts and enjoy them in a new way by breaking down branding and turning it into some other kind of message. I encourage you to read the essay that Renee has included at the bottom of the landing page for this series, Poetry as Advertising. The conclusion of that is magnificent and is exactly this point. I'm not going to take the time to read it, but essentially what the author says, and his name is slipping my mind, it was written in 1946, but as I was saying to Lori earlier, feels prophetic for right now. He says, if poetry is going to become something else for us right now, we're going to have to begin to connect with life in a broader sense, life as politics, life as science, life as journalism. And for me, making these collage poems out of advertising is deconstructing somebody's intent to sell something to me and turning it into living in a broader sense, actually connecting with I believe, what it means to live a good life. Let's do one more, and then I actually want to just take a 5-10 minute break and see what we might be able to make together. Let's see what this one is. Versioned poems. So this idea is coming from two poets primarily, one that I've spent a lot of time studying and one who I've kind of flirted off and on with. Jane Hirschfield is one of them. She has this beautiful quote on translation. She's translated a lot of Japanese and Chinese poets without knowing their languages, and we're going to talk about that. Translated works are Trojan horses, carriers of secret invasion. They open the imagination to new images and beliefs, new modes of thought. There again, we've got that poetic thinking, new sounds. Mistrust of translation is part of the instinctive immune reaction by which every community attempts to preserve its particular heritage and flavor. To control language is to control thought. The realization lends an extra dimension to that well-known Italian saying, traditore, traditori, translator, traitor. Forgive my butchering of the Italian language, from Jane Hirschfield. This is very much where poetry becomes a kind of response, where we can take something that was meant to be in a particular culture, in a particular setting, in a particular time, and bring it to today. I've got a couple examples here. They are kind of patron poets here. Christian Wyman, who versioned the work of Ossip Mandelstam. If you see on my camera there in this volume called Stolen Air. And in the back of this, he writes this really lovely little mini essay on versioning poems. He doesn't know Russian. Osip Mandelstam was a Russian poet who lived in the early 1900s, as we talked about last week. And yet he translates or versions these poems. In many ways, he versions them through his own kind of suffering, through his own kind of exile, connecting with the exile of Osip Mandelstam through his own suffering and exile. And then, of course, Jane Hirschfield. Here's kind of one example of versioning that's probably on the outer reaches of versioning. But for me, the starting point of Mary Oliver's poem feels so obvious and so apparent that in a lot of ways it feels like a version. So we've got this very famous Elizabeth Browning poem, "How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways." Right? I won't go through the whole thing. And then we've got this very playful, very fun, I think, version from Mary Oliver. "How do I love you? Oh, this way and that way. Oh, happily. Perhaps I may elaborate by demonstration, like this, and no more words now." In many ways, a response and version of this Elizabeth Browning poem where she says, "We don't have time for words. We've got to get down to what matters." Let's look at something maybe a little bit more controversial. Here is a poem that I have versioned myself. We've first got Osip Mandelstam's Stalin Epigram, a poem that he was ultimately exiled and killed for. "Our lives no longer feel ground under them. At 10 paces, you can't hear our words. But whenever there's a snatch of talk, it turns to the Kremlin mountaineer. The 10 thick worms his fingers, his words like measures of weight, the huge laughing cockroaches on his top lip, the glitter of his boot rims. Ringed with a scum of chicken-necked bosses, he toys with the tributes of half-men. One whistles, another meows, a third snivels. He pokes out his finger, and he alone goes boom. He forges decrees in a line like horseshoes, one for the groin, one for the forehead, temple, eye. He rolls the executions on his tongue like berries. He wishes he could hug them like big friends from home." Powerful,
Whoa.
right? Powerful language. Really dissenting against this political figure. In some ways, maybe inaccessible if you don't fully understand the context of what Mandelstam was living through. I versioned it about another political figure, which might be controversial to some of us. If so, know that this is an experiment and my own perspective. I happily welcome you to disagree with me and version your own poem. I have versioned it a little differently. "Our lives are gassy nightmares now. Tap, tap is this thing on. We made a nest for ourselves to chirp dissent. The sound only summoned him. Tiny hands, tiny thumbs. Plunk, plunk, monosyllabic poo tweets. Flyaway hair on a flyaway brain. He's all squint and whistle. The cluck, cluck of bought men means half as much as his own praise. Self-gratification, his only defense. He gestures to punctuate screeds he thinks are decrees. You'll be fine if you're a dollar sign. Green is the color he counts." By taking poems like this and actually versioning them for our time, we're able to, like a translator who doesn't necessarily know the language, begin to enter into meaning in a more intimate way. So again, we're not connecting with simply the vocabulary of the poet, which is what many translators are aiming for. They're aiming for a literal adaptation of the vocabulary of the poet. Instead, we're aiming to translate the poetic thinking of the poet, which allows us to see a little bit more deeply. Let's go to this one, and then we're going to take a pause before our very final one. So this we mentioned last week, the book Attention Equals Life. Renee and I both really love it, and that author Andrew Epstein talks a lot about this idea of list poems, and he brings up this gentleman, Ron Silliman. But I want to open with this quote from Umberto Eco, which is maybe one of the best quotes on lists that we could possibly get. We have always been fascinated by infinite space, by the endless stars, and by galaxies upon galaxies. How does a person feel when looking at the sky? He thinks that he doesn't have enough tongues to describe what he sees. Nevertheless, people have never stopped describing the sky, simply listing what they see. Lovers are in the same position. They experience a deficiency of language, a lack of words to express their feelings. But do lovers ever stop trying to do so? They create lists. Your eyes are so beautiful, and so is your mouth and your collarbone. One could go on in great detail. But these lists don't have to just be these magnanimous things worth catching our attention, kind of what we talked about last week. They can actually call our attention to the mediocre and the mundane, and not in an attempt to transform it, but actually to leave it as mediocre and mundane, to create a different kind of access for us. And there's this great poem by Ron Silliman, Sitting Up, Standing, Taking Steps. Tuesday a.m. What alarm, ceiling, clock, dull light, urine, toothpaste, blue shirt, jeans, water for coffee, bacon, eggs, soy toast, phony earth shoes, bus, another bus, typewriter, telephone, coworkers, salad, iced tea, more coworkers, bus, ambulance on freeway, another bus, a beer, chicken, rice and squash, today's mail, feces, TV, glass of Chablis, darkness. This mundane journal of a poem, all nouns, truly giving us, in many senses, a better picture of his day than maybe many of us could give through some kind of prose writing. I think, in part, what I'd love to hear from the crowd right now is what badges you would award to this poem and where you see them. Because there were a couple of spots reading through this today where I thought, oh my goodness, if that isn't a good example of, I don't know what is. I'll give you a second.
Just while we're waiting for those adjectives, Iglika calls our attention to Georgy Gospodinov, the famous Bulgarian poet, with his famous poetry books, including Lapidarium. Thank you for
Yes.
the link to the Wikipedia, so we can learn more about this poet.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
So this is definitely the word is definitely not eternal, because there's nothing, in a weird way, though maybe it is.
Yeah.
Maybe because it's so particular,
yes,
so literal, so mediocre and ordinary, that there's something of eternity in that.
I think that you're exactly right, Renee. In part because he hasn't captured an extraordinary day. He's captured the ordinary day. This could very well be, knowing my own kind of habits and rhythms, this could be a day that he experiences often, where he takes the same buses and he has the same glass of Chablis at night, right? And here's where the very fun ambiguity comes into play. Did he miss a bus?
Aha!
Right? Did he
So
miss a bus?
Fred Haas in the chat says almost all Lisp poems create the possibility for ambiguity as the
Yes.
connection between the elements
Yeah.
requires something of the reader. And that's what you just demonstrated just now.
Yes. Or even this. Whose breakfast is who? Was he with someone who had bacon and eggs and he just said, "No, I'll only have toast"? That's reasonable, right? And we just don't know. But he's captured his day in particularity while still actually allowing us to enter into it in a lot of fun ways, and to now begin to speculate and to kind of gossip about what might have been going on in Ron Silliman's day. Was this his day? Maybe it was someone else's. I don't know. And he allows us to enter into that kind of exploration with him. This is really as simple as picking a part of speech and journaling about your day or someone else's. But I want to expand this out to list in general. Someone who I'm really close to, she and I have this little habit of coming up with a list that we want to make for the day, and we write a list and then share it. It's not a list like this that's just a part of speech that journals our day. It might be something as abstract as, what are the colors of water you might see throughout your life, from the dark blue of the Atlantic to something more crystalline in the Gulf, to whatever it might be, right? The little pink bubbles that form around radishes as you put them in a pan. All of those are water that we might see, or something as mundane as, what are the sights and sounds around you. And those things become poems that we can enter into and create much, much more simply than starting with a blank page and crafting that margin into some word sculpture, right? Okay, we've got a few minutes. Let's go to our last one, and then we're going to break off to actually make things. This one I'm calling a rivened poem. This is grammatically incorrect, but give me a break. I mean, this is all about poetry. I'm taking some poetic license. I think this is supposed to actually be rive. It just doesn't sound good to me, so I'm calling it rivened. A rivened poem comes from this idea of this poet that this poet and poem that we talked about last week, Christian Wyman, who has this poem, "God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made." And in each stanza, he returns to this first line, but he breaks this sentence up with different punctuation in order to create different meanings. So, real quick, God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. Sing his being simply by being the thing it is, stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes belonging. To every riven thing he's made is given one shade. Okay, so you get the point. He's taking this sentence and he's cutting it up and allowing that new cut up thought to be something new. What I love about this is that it takes a lot of poetic forms that are kind of meant to limit our sentence structure in a way that creates new meaning. It takes that, but it simplifies it. So if you know, like a pantoum, where the first and third line of a stanza then become the second and fourth line of the next stanza. Very fun, but pretty difficult to create. This is a little bit more accessible. So what I want to do now is I want us to break off. I'm going to start taking some questions in the chat and talking out loud about them. But I want us to break off, choose one of these kind of formats. So we've got blackout poems, collage poems, which might be kind of hard unless, like me, you have some X-Acto knives just sitting on your desk. We've got versioned poems. We've got ribboned poems, and we've got list poems. And I want you to make one in the next 10 to 15 minutes, because most of these don't take much longer than that. I've actually prepared a few ribboned poem prompts. We find meaning in the smallest things we see. So there's a first line that you can take, and you can ribbon that up in whatever way you want. Here's the second one. We keep singing to be made new. And these all only took me a few minutes to come up with. So if you want to come up with your own, come up with your own. He kept saying that he would change. And then finally, I stopped waiting for time to change me. So all of these follow that very God goes belonging to every ribbon thing he's made kind of sentence structure, so that it allows you to ribbon that at the beginning and end of each stanza. So pick one of those if you want. If you've got a newspaper or magazine near you, grab that. Another thing I often do is if I'm desperate to make a blackout poem and I've got my iPad or iPhone, I don't love this because it doesn't give us the 2 columns, but just go to the New York Times website, screenshot an article, and then you can just use your finger on your iPhone and start blacking things out and making something. Or go for the list poem. Go for that, colors of water you might see, or things around you right now, or your day in adjectives, whatever it might be. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'll give one more second to just write down a prompt if you like any of these prompts. And then if you want to chat in a question, if not, I'd love to start seeing the list poems that you create. And I might even pull up my document camera and start making something myself. And we will just work together for a few minutes. Oh yeah, I love that. Darkness and AM in the beginning. That's good. So any questions about these methods? Or if you want to start sharing in the chat your own works, I would love to see them. I'm going to pull out a newspaper and see if I can't make something. I've got the Greenville News in front of me, which is where I'm from. It's probably going to give me a very Southern, very sports-centered vocabulary, if I'm being honest. Same in Melbourne. Ooh, I've got this really nice phrase, going beyond the traditional. That sounds kind of nice. It's also got the classic approach on the page. This sounds pretty good. Plus, it's about gardening. Any questions or ideas from you all about connecting with poetry in this way?
We're working. I'm making a Twitter poem.
Oh, good. Lori, this is fun. Good. I'm glad that you think it's fun. I'm actually going to share too. I'm going to share the link so that you all can join me in this little presentation area I've created. And we can start some discussion threads in here based on whatever poetry style you tried out, and see each other's work. Ooh, we find meanings in the smallest things we see. Oh, good, April. I'm glad that you chose that line. That was one of my favorite ones. So if you click this link I'm about to share, you'll join me in that whole presentation. You'll get a recap of last week, all of the notes and slides from that. Plus, you'll get to see all the stuff from this week. And you can share in threaded discussion there, whatever poems that you create. Oh, yeah. Just read a sentence from the newspaper, making margins of silence, then change them. And again, yes. Let's see. Switch this camera. So here's my own newspaper. So we'll zoom in a little there. Ooh, I like this tried and true formula. That's really nice. Ooh, and cascading. I'm a sucker for poems that begin with some conjunction, so I'm really tempted by this, but maybe. Oh, but this. Like Venus flytraps. Oh, what about this? Like Venus flytraps on window boxes. Like Venus flytraps on windows boxes. They add color. And then your mind starts searching for something. Then I actually want to start like making some kind of meaning actually that might not be there. So I've got like Venus flytraps on window boxes, and I'll go back and clean this up. I kind of want to, I don't know, I want it to say something about maybe like being attractive but deadly. Like, what are we going to get out of that, right? Oh, and we've got people get killed. And we've got potential hazard. Like Venus flytraps on window boxes. We could do like to add color. Could actually make this TE. A little trick here. If you need a 2, you just color in your E. Now we've got a 2 to add color. Library of Babel. Oh, okay. Here's April's poem. So I'm going to stop mine real quick. Let's see. Oh, that's beautiful, April. So good. Okay, so I would love for you all to join me in our little, let's see, it looks like we've already got 3 in here. Oh no, way more than that. We've got 5 or so in here. I would love for you all to keep working on whatever poems that you're creating right now, and for us to just fill up that lesson with whatever we've created, blackout poems or collage poems or list poems, whatever it might be. And I'd love to hear too. I'll create another step in there for other ideas that you might have for how you connect your learners to what poetry can be for us. This has been a lot of fun learning with you. And I'm very excited about continuing this to next week, which is where we'll do a live recording of Poetry for Humans and explore reading poems out loud together in a kind of vulnerable way. I'm happy to answer any other final questions.
Christian, I am absolutely I'm flabbergasted by the fact that I wrote a poem in 5 minutes,
Oh,
and
good.
that you've given me 5 different poetic structures I can learn to pay attention to the symbolic world and my lived experience, and transform the ephemeral into the eternal. I can't tell you what fun it has been to see how you guided us through what seems like a really engaging way to play with language.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. Well, I will see you all next week then. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Round of applause for Christian Shockley. You rock, buddy.
Oh,
We'll see
thank
you
you.
guys next week.
Bye, Denise. Bye, Lori.